Welcome, everyone. We are very pleased that you could join our program today. As you know, today's program is a book discussion on women and inequality in a changing world. I'm Hoda Mahmoudi. I'm the holder of the Bahá'í Chair for World Peace. We are at the University of Maryland in College Park. You know, the Bahá'í Chair in its ongoing program to explore world peace and how do we try to create a more peaceful world, basically examines the obstacles that get in our way when we explore this very difficult topic. And basically what it boils down to, and I'm not trying to simplify it, is that it's really how human beings treat one another that we find is the most important factor in how we should advance towards a more peaceful world. And so I always say it's not, and others have said, it's not just putting an end to war, because you can have a world in which there's not a single war taking place, but there are still wars taking place between individuals based on various issues, prejudices, and assumptions. And so it is our hope that today's program will examine this issue when it comes to the important role of women and the empowerment of women, their equality in relation to their contribution to a more peaceful world. We think this is a very important topic, one that should receive much more attention. And we hope that today's discussion will help us to better understand this phenomenon. So in 2023, the Bahá'í Chair published an edited volume, which you see on the screen, called Women and Inequality in a Changing World. And the volume basically explores the obstacles that women face in their equal participation in all areas of daily life, social, economic, cultural, and the like. The volume really deepens and widens our understanding of women in relation to the inequalities they face, based not only on gender, but also on race, class, religion, and more. It also highlights the progress that women have made and how this progress contributes to the education of more peaceful and prosperous society. Bringing together scholars and practitioners from across the globe to provide a wider range of perspectives and experiences, this volume examines crucial questions and offers innovative solutions to increasing women's role in the process of advancing the world closer to peace. I want to just emphasize to the audience that if you go online, this book is actually available to you. It's an open access book. You don't have to purchase it, so that you will have access to it and you can read the other chapters as well. So now to today's program. We are fortunate to have two scholars who each contributed a chapter to this book. Each of them will make a short presentation about the content of the chapter which they wrote for the book. And after their presentations, we will, of course, open up the session to questions from the audience. And you can go to the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen to do so when the time comes. So I will begin with our first presenter, Dr. Tiffani Betts Razavi. She is the visiting research professor at the Bahá'í Chair for World Peace at the University of Maryland. She holds a doctorate of philosophy in psychology from the University of Oxford and has lectured in psychology, research methods, and organizational behavior at the University of Southampton. She has also coordinated value-based curriculum development for the spiritual education of children. Her research and writing explore human values in education and the workplace, integrative approaches to peace, social change, gender equality, and education. Recently, she has published in various journals, including Journal of Peace Education, Springer, Nature, Social Sciences, and the Journal of Peace and Change, as well as contributed to volumes, edited volumes, with the title of Transglobal Humanities, Meeting the Moment, Global Climate Crisis, Seeking Environmental Justice and Climate Equality, and the subject of today's discussion, Women and Inequality in a Changing World, Exploring New Paradigms for Peace. Dr. Razavi's research and writing explore people and their environments, the changing nature of work and education, and women and peace. She is especially interested in human values and in the conversations that connect observation and insight with practice. We are very pleased to have her with us today. Welcome, Dr. Razavi.
Thank you very much, Hoda. You make it sound like I've done a lot of things. I'm not sure I really have, but I'm happy to be here to be able to talk a little bit about this chapter in this book. And also, I look forward to widening the conversation with the rest of the participants who are able to join us today. Before I go into the ideas that are in the chapter, I thought it might be interesting to start with a little backstory. As I was preparing for today, I was thinking on my experience of working with the Bahá'í Chair for World Peace and realized that the event that I first attended that brought me into contact with the chair was the conference about women and inequality in a changing world. And it was an eye-opener. It led to the book that we're discussing today, and I thought I need to go back and share with you a little bit of why and how the experience of that event shaped the way that I approach the chapter that I'm going to be talking about. At the time, it really struck me attending the conference that the range of participation was so wide. There were women from such varied backgrounds and generations sharing research, ideas, different ways of looking at women and equality in the world, from reflections on second wave feminism, scholar activism, brain mosaics, the power of silence. All of this was new to me. So when I thought about it, I put it into the framework of things that I work with. At that time, I was working, as Hoda mentioned, on some educational materials for the moral and spiritual development of children. And my experience at this conference reminded me very much of a story. It's a parable, which is an ancient story, and depending on which version of it you read, it has a different ending. But I'll tell you the one that I like best. So the parable of the blind people and the elephant. To be fair, and it's a bit ironic, but in most of the versions of the story that you look at, it's blind men and the elephant, but we're going with people today. So the blind people and the elephant. For the first time, an elephant enters the village in which these blind people live. And each one reaches out to touch this animal to try to work out what it is. And each one, of course, describes it differently. One touches the trunk of the elephant and says, this must be a snake. One touches the tail of the elephant and says, I think this is a piece of rope. Another touches the ear and says, this is some kind of a fan. Another the leg, etc., etc. So in my version of the story, the people put their perspectives together. And in order to avoid disagreement and confusion, by sharing their views, they come up with a complete picture of what the elephant is. In other words, we can't understand the reality of something before us unless we put all the pieces together, unless we combine all the different perceptions and experiences. So after attending this conference about women and being asked to then contribute a chapter, I asked myself, what can I bring? What are my experiences and perceptions that might add a little bit of something to the big picture of this big elephant? So what I decided to do at the time was to make a bridge from the action research that I was doing in education to this idea of women in the world. One of the realizations that had come about as a result of doing this action research was that in order to develop a peace-oriented mindset in the next generation, in the younger generation, we had to prompt a kind of challenging of assumptions among the generation of educators. And this idea of challenging assumptions became part of our learning process in our action research and in our development of materials. So for me, it seemed like the natural thing to do when faced with the question of paradigm shift and women in the world was to look at underlying assumptions. So that's the route that I took. I'm sure all of us have come across this phrase paradigm shift a lot. It's something that I actually think is a little bit overused, but I wanted to understand it better. So I really started from first principles in this chapter. If you have a chance to read it, you'll see that I start by considering the idea of a paradigm. What does that mean? And I describe it really as a worldview, an accepted way of perceiving things, of the whole world or just some aspect of it. And then I ask myself the question, what does it mean to shift a paradigm? It's not just a little thing. It's something significant. It's about an entirely new way of looking at whatever that is, or maybe even at the whole world. And not only a different way of looking at it, but it means that whole way of looking at it takes hold among a significant group of people and becomes the norm. So again, walking it back, I look at the idea of what are the assumptions that we have about women and equality, and how do we examine those assumptions? We can't assume that our assumptions are right, and we can't assume that they're wrong. So we hold them up against existing data, and we look to the data to tell us whether our assumptions are borne out or whether we are facing anomalies. And if we're faced too many anomalies, we have to consider the possibility of changing our worldview. And that's paradigm shift. So in the chapter, I mean, of course, there are many ways of looking at the assumptions that exist around the question of equality of women and men. In this chapter, I choose 3 to look at. So I'm going to take you through them briefly now. And of course, welcome to read in more detail. Always better to read it because you never know what I might remember and not remember to tell you. The first assumption that I consider is the idea that time is all we need. So the idea that, paradigm shift takes time. We do understand that women and men are equal, but it just is going to take a while for us to get there. We just need to stay the course. Okay, so on this assumption, we would expect that the process of equality would move forward consistently. So then you look at the metrics, the measures of gender equality, and there's a lot of ways, again, of looking at this, and I won't be exhaustive in what I share with you. But looking at some of the basic metrics, we can see that to some extent this assumption is upheld. We are over recent decades, we're seeing more women in the workforce. Women have more protection under the law. They have more access to education. They have more access to healthcare. This is, of course, there are going to be exceptions in all of these trends, depending on exactly where you draw your geographical lines and where you start and end your timeline as well. Indeed, since I wrote the chapter, I think there have been some changes. But in general, we're seeing, on the whole, in the grand sweep of history, women, according to parity measures, women are becoming more equal in society. The challenge is that we also see some other trends when we look at the data in more detail. For example, yes, in the United States, for example, there are more women in the workforce, in the paid workforce. But those women are also spending more time, not less time, on childcare. Not only more time on childcare than men, but also more time on childcare than women did when they were less present in the workforce. So that's confusing. Another example, one of my favorites, is a set of studies called the Draw a Scientist study. This is when children of different ages are asked to draw a scientist. And then the researchers look at the sex of the scientists that are drawn. In the original study, which I think was carried out at sometime maybe between 1966, they did a series up until 1977. I think 0.3% of the participants of the children drew a female scientist. that percentage increases when we move into up into like the early 2000s. It increases up to 28%, which is still quite low. So and we also see some interesting trends around the ages of the children who do this and who they are. In both cases, I believe, but you can check the chapter. In the first case, certainly in the 0.3%, only the girls drew female scientists, never boys. And more recently, again, the preponderance is for female participants to draw female scientists rather than the boy participants to do so. So this doesn't suggest that just by continuing on the course that we're on, we're getting closer to gender equality. There's still some bifurcation. This trend that I just described in the Draw Scientist study also applies in a bigger sense, and I think this one you might have heard a little bit more about because it's been catching some more headlines recently, which is that the idea that we are moving towards a goal of equality would seem to require that attitudes towards gender equality would consistently become more positive. And up to a certain point, we were seeing this. Every generation tended to be more interested in equality than the previous one among both women and men. But in recent times, and at the time that I wrote the chapter, the most recent or the youngest generation that had been surveyed was the millennials. And we were already beginning to see in the millennial generation a separation. We were beginning to see men of that generation less favorable towards gender equality than their fathers, let's say. And we're now seeing in the last few years, we've now begun, some surveys have now included the next generation of Generation Z or Z, depending on where you're from, who are also not as favorable towards gender equality as the previous generation. So that's a big question. So this first assumption, is time all we need? Should we just stay the course? It doesn't look like it. It doesn't look like this assumption holds. Second assumption is what I call in the chapter add women and mix. Are we okay just to keep society and its structures and its systems the way they are? And it's just a question of making sure that women are part of them. And that would be fine for equality. That would be equality. It's again a kind of a numerical parity assumption. And again, mixed and kind of confusing evidence in some ways, but on the whole, not good evidence that this assumption really is borne out. What we find is that there is still very much in the world, despite conversations about equality and despite movement in that direction, still very much what some researchers call a default male mindset. The default male is this idea that the male represents the universal human being, and this creeps into all aspects of our life. There's plenty of data available on this, and when you begin to read it, it is actually quite staggering the extent to which the default male appears in our news, in our language, in our literature, in our science, in our transport system, city planning, you name it, it seems to be there. I'll share with you a couple of examples that were quite striking to me. One of the ones that I include in the chapter is about characters in children's books. So apart from an uneven ratio of the appearance of male and female characters, there's also a strange difference in the assignment of gender to non-human characters. So, children's books often include animals, plants, even inanimate objects, like crayons. They get ascribed a gender, and 73% of the time, they're male. It's interesting. Second example, which I find interesting also, because also of my background in the workplace and work psychology, is that in the workplace, there are, as you are all probably aware, many issues to do with the advancement of women through workplace structures and reaching the levels of leadership in various organizations. Again, in the chapter, you'll see various statistics around the participation of women in different sectors. And even when participation is high, the prevalence of women in the level of leadership is generally disproportionately low. But the interesting thing that I came across when doing the research for this chapter was also that around people's perceptions of why this is the case. And most often, the reason that's given for the limited or let's say the staggered participation of women at the leadership level is work-family balance. That women have responsibilities in the home, they have things that they need to do, and they're therefore not able to give as much attention to the workplace activities as they could, or maybe there's the mother gap. This kind of thing is the explanation that's often given for the disparities that exist in the progression of women in workplace settings. The odd thing and the anomaly here is that this difference in progression does not seem to apply to women without children. And when workers, both men and women, are confronted with this idea that how can we explain this? Really, there's no good answer that the participants are at a loss to explain. The only model that we have in our minds is this idea that of the bifurcation of male and female labor. So again, going back to the assumption, is it okay to go on with the idea that adding women to existing structures will get us to equality? I think the evidence suggests not so much. Final assumption that I address in the chapter is related actually, and going back to, again, a very basic set of ideas, which have to do with the physicality of men and women, about our biology, and the assumption that because we are biologically different, that these biological differences map onto different social roles and possibilities for women and men. To me, looking at the data, the assumption boils down to two parts. One is to do with the mind and the brain, and the other is really to do with where human capacity comes from. So the first is that the idea that there's a male and a female brain, that brains are binary in nature, and you've got to kind of work out what are women good at, what are men good at, because of the way their brains are wired and set up. And when you look at the neuropsychological and neurological evidence about brains, that's not upheld. There's a long history, and it's a little bit confusing when I looked into it. You've got times when people are finding differences, times when people are not finding differences, times when people are looking at the brain less as a whole organ and more as in what is called a mosaic. And in these things, we can see different patterns of functioning, but none of the evidence, as far as I could see, really upholds the idea that there are two distinct forms of brains that would map onto functions within a society. And that relates to the second aspect of the assumption, which is that there's a sort of assumed dichotomy between nature and nurture. That is, in other words, that women are born with a certain type of brain, men are born with a different type of brain, and that's it. There really is not much evidence for this at all. And the nurture, the environmental influence on personal development, on psychological development, mental and emotional development, starts very, very early. And in some ways, it even starts pre-birth. And that evidence is clear. And I feel that through this muddled kind of mess of data in biology, nature, nurture, it does not at all point to the idea that we can establish equality only on the basis of assumptions around a predetermined set of differences. In fact, it calls to question whether we should label anything, and if so, what we should label male, female, masculine, and feminine. So based on these observations, I tried to then think about what are the implications of these observations, these assumptions, and the challenging data that I found. What's the implication of that for a paradigm, a new paradigm, which is the title of the volume, a new paradigm for peace. And the way that I decided to think about it was in terms of the characteristics and qualities that such a paradigm would need to have based on those observations. Let's start with where we just left off on the idea of binaries. The idea of binaries seems to have imposed significant limitations. So whatever paradigm we move into, it has to move beyond that. I think it has to be something more complex, something more organic than that. So that's one of the features that I identify as part of the new paradigm. And that fits also going right back to the story of the elephant. You know, it's not going to be, it's not a tail or a trunk, an ear or a leg. It's going to be something much bigger, much more complex than we probably had envisaged. And that also links to another feature, which is not only is it complex, not only is it organic, but it must somehow be integrated. So all the pieces it needs to be clear how all the pieces come together. And for me, the unifying feature in such a paradigm is a focus on what I would call a kind of a transcendent notion. I don't know if transcendent is the best word for it, but it's a conception of human nature that does transcend other identities. And in this period during which we've heard a lot about identity politics and the importance of identity, questions around intersectionality, focusing on subordinate identities, we might say, maybe the missing piece here is to help us to integrate it, is to balance out that diversity, which I think is important in an understanding of equality, with something that is integrative. And that I think we might see in the notion of a higher human nature. In the chapter, I describe it in terms of human nobility. And finally, with all that in mind, there's something around the approach that we adopt to equality, the method that we use in order to move towards equality, that has to be coherent. So the exercise of looking at all of these assumptions, I think, showed me a couple of things. One was that we're striving towards a state of equality that we're just discovering. We don't actually know what it is. And it is a process. But the only way we can discover it is to increasingly apply the lessons that we're learning to the way that we walk the path towards equality. And that perspective actually does give me hope, because I think that despite the way that I've described certain things, I think there is progress. I think that for all the anomalies that are there, we also see human beings making effort to apply some of these kinds of lessons to the path to peace, to the changing of mindsets, to the way in which individual lives and communal lives are lived. And also, you know, the evidence in general on paradigm shifts suggests that paradigms do shift. People do change. People do choose a path and with a sense of purpose walk it, even though it's difficult. And in the end, we reach it. So on that note, a note of hope, I hope, I would like to hear a little bit more from Kate and put all of these thoughts and reflections together and look forward to the rest of our conversation.
Thank you so much, Dr. Razavi. We'll look forward to the Q&A because you raised so many important issues in your presentation. Before I introduce Dr. Seaman, I just want to remind you that in the chat box, you can find the link to the book. And as I mentioned earlier, it is an open access, so it's free to read. And we encourage you to go to the link. Our next speaker is Dr. Kate Seaman. She is the Assistant Director for the Baha'i Chair for World Peace. And here she works to support the research activities of the chair, among other things. Prior to joining the University of Maryland, Dr. Seaman spent a year as senior fellow at a nonprofit in Washington, D.C., with a focus on genocide prevention. As senior fellow, Dr. Seaman was responsible for establishing field research projects in Nigeria and Myanmar. She has also taught at the University of Baltimore, and prior to relocating to the USA, was a teaching fellow at the University of Bath and a postdoctoral fellow at the University of East Anglia. Dr. Seaman is a specialist in peace studies, and she received her PhD in political science and peace studies from Lancaster University, where she studied under Richardson Institute for Peace Research. Her current research interests include the concept of state responsibility, United Nations peacekeeping operations, global security governance, the ethics of international interventions, and the development of the responsibility to protect. Dr. Seaman holds a Master's of Arts in Diplomacy and a BA honors in Political and International Relations from Lancaster University in the UK. Her publications include her book called UN Tide, or UN-Tide Nations, the UN Peacekeeping and the Development of Global Security Governance, published with Routledge. And of course, she has edited, I don't want to list all of them, but tons of books with the Baha'i Chair. The one that is being featured today, another book on infrastructure, well-being, and the measurement of happiness, another on the fundamental challenges to global peace and security, and the changing ethos of human rights. So with that, I welcome Dr. Seaman. The floor is yours, please.
Thank you very much. I'm excited to be here today and to share this time with all the participants who I appreciate attending, and I look forward to the questions and the discussion. One of my favorite things about working at the Baha'i Chair is the interdisciplinarity of the work that we do, and the importance that this has in understanding the challenges that we face in society today. So this chapter that I'm going to talk to you about today draws on scholarship from the fields of both feminist international relations and feminist geography. And in this chapter, we focus on how gender interacts with other power relationships. So how these complex power relations intersect with the concepts of place, space, and time, and then also how these interactions either reduce or increase the barriers to women's agency. So in the chapter, we begin with an exploration of agency, how the role of women has been constructed throughout history, and how this impacts on women's ability as diverse subjects to act on their own desires and to define and pursue their own goals. The remainder of the chapter that I'm going to talk about today is divided into 3 sections. So the first examines the concept of place, the second space, and the third time. And throughout these 3 sections, there also runs a thread examining the role of relationships and solidarity and the changes that are required in each of these 3 concepts to truly create a world of equality and change in the future. So in our approach, we seek to understand not just a single dynamic of power, but rather the webs of power within social relationships. And the starting point for our examination of agency, gender, and power is the socially constructed division between the public sphere and the private, which develops a little bit more some of the things that Dr. Razavi was talking about in her presentation as well. And so the separation between the public and private also includes a division between what are determined to be rational activities reserved for the public sphere, things like politics, economics, law, and the natural activities that are relegated to the private sphere. So family responsibilities, childcare, and caring responsibilities. And within this division of activities, what you see then is a confinement of women to the private sphere, the familial sphere, while simultaneously also providing an explanation and an ideological foundation for women's oppression. And so the introduction of power, dominance, and subordination into the equation demonstrates the inequalities of the gender hierarchy that exists both in the past and in society today. And while there is variation in gender relations across cultures, the inequalities inherent in the hierarchical gender structure are near universal, meaning that gender as a structure provides a crucial insight into relationships of power. And gender as a structure impacts on the entirety of human experience. So starting from childhood, boys and girls grow up effectively in entirely different social contexts with vastly different norms, expectations, and agency. And so for this reason, while the focus on the female experience is important and necessary, we must also not neglect the male experience, as the activities of all are shaped through the interaction between the social context, norms, and power relations. So in the current system, power takes a male form, specifically a white one, and powerlessness takes a female form. However, in this chapter, what we want to do is push back against that dichotomy in order to complexify the power relations. So therefore, in our approach, we seek to understand not just a single dynamic of power, but rather the webs of power within social relationships. So we conceptualize power as multifaceted, diffuse, and relational. So women's agency is directly linked to and limited by the power structures and relations of gender. And it is the variation in these constraints and how this impacts on women's agency that I'm going to talk a little bit about next. So for us, agency is defined as the ability to define one's goals and to act on them. The rules and norms governing social interactions restrict women's abilities to both define their goals and then to act on them. So as Hanmer and Klugman argue, agency invokes an ability to overcome barriers, to question or confront situations of oppression and deprivation, and as individuals or together with others, to have influence and be heard in society. So agency, therefore, provides the possibility of transforming power arrangements, and we need to be clear about and conscious of the constraints in and positions from which women are operating within those abilities to challenge these power arrangements. So we have to acknowledge the way in which women's responses and choices in how to respond to the patriarchal system and the associated cultural practices are constrained, while also recognizing the choices that are available within those constraints, as this influences the different kinds of policies that feminists can and should support. These choices are also connected to individual experiences, and a feminist approach therefore requires a focus on what we coming from feminist geography is termed situated knowledges, so knowledge from different experiences. And we have to recognize the ways in which gender and the patriarchal system have been internalized. So from a young age, women learn to perceive themselves as objects. Their identities become both gendered and individualized. And this has the potential to damage agentic capacity, which can be attributed to the internalization of this oppression, whereby the subordination assigned to women as a gender is internalized and becomes integrated into each woman's identity, but to each individual woman in a different and unique way. So women will, in many cases, self-limit. They'll choose the path of least resistance based on their internalized recognition of the inherent inequalities of the current patriarchal system. So the subordination of women within the current system is both socially and legally institutionalized. So as McKinnon argues, this reality systematically deprives women of human dignity, respect, resources, physical security, credibility, full membership in our communities, speech, and power. But this system is not natural, however. Rather, as Harding suggests, there are three processes involved in the creation of our current gendered social life. So the first of these is gender symbolism. So the assignment of dualistic gender metaphors to perceive dichotomies, so male, female, public, private, strong, weak, etc. The second of these processes is the gender structure. So we then utilize these dualisms to organize social activities between males and females and assigning different activities based on these perceived dichotomies of who is stronger, who is weaker, who is more rational, who is more caring. And this is then the third process, the division of these social activities between the different groups of humans based on this, this division of labor. And so these three processes contribute to the complex socially structured regime of gender difference that is systematically reproduced across all areas of social life, politics, economics, culture, and institution. However, the difference is in fact both fluid and relational. So you cannot have one side of the dichotomy without the other. The inequality between the genders is therefore not a single variable. Rather, as Tickner argues, it is a historically contingent, complex confluence of sociocultural power relationships, including the associated subjective understandings. And so this is why an emphasis on claims to legal and political rights in ensuring equality for women is insufficient in attempting to transform the current gender-based power systems, because it doesn't eliminate the underlying structures or the mechanisms of production or the dominant gender regime or male dominance. So as Olufemi argues in 2020, a feminism that seeks power instead of questioning it does not care about justice. Instead, Olufemi argues that we should practice radical compassion, and examine what our politics can help articulate and the violence that it can expose. So instead of attempting to work within the system, we need to subvert it. And as history shows us, subversion and, more importantly, resistance has always existed. Feminist activists have always pushed boundaries set by the state, by men, by the powerful, and in doing so have laid foundations for a new world. And it's these foundations that we need to build on in order to radically alter the spaces accessible to women and the places women can operate from and engage with. So then we move on to this concept of place. So what do we mean by place? And for this, we don't mean a physical place or a limitation of a singular place. For our purposes, we're interested in place as an idea of positionality, of women's place within the power relation and systems of patriarchy. And what does place actually mean to women? How does it shape their daily lives and their sense of self? And how does it limit or encourage their agency? For us, place is not only a territorial bounded notion, it is also a position within a network of social relationships, a position which influences the capacity of individual women to define their goals and act on them, agency, as we've talked about. As Dr. Razavi already mentioned, the default for many places and spaces is male. And so what we're also interested in is how women adapt themselves to places, or how they contest these places that were not designed for them, and that in many ways accommodate them only as special cases which deviate from the norm, read male. In this sense, then, we're also interested in this notion of space. And so with space, what we mean is recognizing the divides, how the privilege of access to certain spaces can be used to further divide women, and how this can be a primary tool for highlighting the insidious ways in which the patriarchal system utilizes difference, be it cultural, social, political, or other, to keep us divided and perpetuate its own survival. So our job is to open up this idea of space, to make the invisible visible, to bring the margins into the center, and to transform the trivial to important, and to put the spotlight on women as competent actors, as subjects in their own right, rather than as objects for men. For women, their power geometry is currently limited based on both identity and space. And so for Massey, this is most clearly identifiable in the West with a specific distinction between the public and private spheres, which I've already discussed, and the attempts to confine women to the domestic sphere as both a specifically spatial control and through that a social control on identity. Women have been limited in their ability to move between spaces. And again, the restriction of women's mobility has been in some cultural contexts a crucial means of ensuring their subordination. This subordination has been dependent on limitations on both identity and space. And as Massey continues to argue, the two things, this limitation on mobility and space and the attempted consignment or confinement to particular places on the one hand, and the limitation on identity on the other, have been crucially related. And this is why many feminist movements have focused on breaking down the dichotomies between the public and private spheres and between formal and informal politics. And in doing this, this then allows for examination of the ways in which women actively create new and different spaces for political action. It also allows for challenges to the notion that the private sphere or the home is restricted to and dominated by particular concerns that do not translate to the universal. And so throughout history and throughout the history of feminist movements, women's activism has relied on the reclamation and redefinition of public spaces. Women's collective and political action also more often occurs outside of the formal political sphere and tends to be in more fluid and diffuse organizations. So what's interesting to note here is the ways in which these less formal organizations and newly created spaces can also take shape around privileges and exclusions of race, class, parental status, age, etc. So therefore, even women's spaces can never be just about gender or women as a pre-existent unified group. And so here, as Hooks in 1984 asked, we need to question whether women share a common vision of what equality actually means, and how does this determine the ways in which spaces for women are created and maintained. As Dr. Razavi also mentioned, the question of time is really important. Is it just going to take time. And so opening up space for progress does take time, and time is the third concept which we examine in this chapter. Here we argue that we shouldn't be trying to orientate ourselves using a multilinear, or sorry, a linear understanding of time. Rather, we should be using a multilinear and multidimensional model of time. So rather than viewing time as linear and the progress towards women's equality as one directional, this instead allows us to recognize and highlight the differentiated experiences and the existence of continuity and discontinuity in practices over time. And so we can look to history for examples of how women's experiences have been altered by global events, how progress has been made and then revoked and then made again. And so globally, currently 75% of unpaid work is done by women who spend between 3 and 6 hours a day on it, compared to a man's average of 30 minutes to 2 hours. So this here is a clear example of how men and women experience time differently, an example of how the ways in which spaces and places are gendered, and that even with the variation between cultures and over time, women's time is limited. It's limited by the expectations of the tasks we are expected to undertake, the societal pressures we are placed under to fulfill our gendered roles. However, if we return to the idea of time as multilinear and multidimensional, this opens up space for a more radical and interesting approach. It enables us to recognize the culturally and historically specific forms which inequalities between the sexes take, and how the variation in how these inequalities are inflicted and shaped by their interaction with class and race. And so throughout this chapter, we explore how complex gendered power relationships intersect with the concepts of space, place, and time, and how these interactions either reduce or increase the barriers to women's agency. So women face a daily battle to navigate spaces that default male, and altering this reality requires changing the way in which politics is both conceptualized and spatialized. And so despite the progress that has been made, the artificial divides between the public and the private spheres are still enforced in many ways. And as Dr. Razavi has also discussed, it's also clear that simply adding more women to institutional structures and systems designed for and by men is not having the impact required to truly alter the inequalities between the genders. So what is required is a new approach to how we understand the lived embodied experiences of women. We need to open up space for difficult conversations to recognize that the path to progress is not the same for everyone. We need to recognize the importance of solidarity and solidarity across differences for true progress to be made. So we cannot rely on outdated and static approaches to changing the current systems and institutions. Instead, we need to imagine alternatives, alternative spaces, alternative places, and alternative times. So thank you very much, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you so much, Dr. Seaman. A lot to think about. And I thank both of the presenters for their really quite insightful comments and thought-provoking ideas. Lots of questions, and I'm now directing the audience to please go to the Q&A function and post your questions for our presenters. But I will start this session with my question, if I may. And I'll start with Dr. Seaman. Why do you think the progress towards closing the global gender gap has been so slow?
That's a big question to start with. I think what we see is cycles of progress, and then kind of a pushback against that progress. And I think we're seeing that currently. And I think a lot of it has to do with struggling with a loss of privilege on the other side. And so how men in particular are responding to the challenges. And I think that's why it takes a long time to change minds. I think education is a crucial part of that, kind of going forward. Yeah, I think that's just why it's taking a really long time.
Dr. Razavi, would you like to add anything to that?
Of course, I agree. I mean, I think that sometimes I feel it's slow, and sometimes I think maybe it isn't, and it depends on the time frame that we choose to adopt. considering the centuries and millennia during which there was such extreme inequality between women and men in the world, where we are now is actually, and the time that it's taken to make the progress that we've made in the last century, let's say, is actually quite significant. So in that sense, maybe it isn't as slow as we perceive it. In the time frame of our own lifetimes, it seems very slow, right? So this, I think, goes back to what Dr. Seaman was saying about, the multilinearity, I guess, or the non-linearity of our perceptions about how these things happen. At the level of what's happening now, let's say within our lifetimes, I think also it's layered. So I think we have seen change, but in my mind, it's a kind of superficial change. It's this kind of change at the level of the parity metrics. And I think why we feel it as slow is because it's at the surface, and we're not feeling the deep change. And that deep change does seem to be taking a long time relative to the superficial change. We say, well, if superficial change can happen this quickly, why can't deep change happen this quickly? But there are two different types of change. And so that's another way of looking at it.
Thank you very much. From our audience, we have a question. Thank you for your talk. This is a question for both speakers and was touched on briefly by Dr. Razavi. What is the best way to think of the increasing gender split along political and philosophical lines we witnessed during the last election, a split which crossed race, class, immigration status, and geopolitical boundaries? What are we, or what are they, in quotation marks, doing wrong? Dr. Seaman, would you like to start this one?
Sure. I think this again comes back to the socialization processes, which I touched on, and how both women and men are socialized into their gender roles. And what we are perhaps seeing is a return to a more extreme interpretation of what those roles are. I think what's interesting in relation to this question is what Dr. Razavi was talking about in her presentation, is that actually fundamentally there aren't that many differences between women and men, even though we have been taught that there are. And I'm thinking about this particularly in relation to what you were talking about in brain mapping studies, and how there isn't a kind of a nature or a nurture component to that. Everything all combines into that. And so I don't know that we, or I don't know if it's a we and a they. I think it's a collective. Everybody is getting things wrong. And again, I want to return to the question of education, and what are we teaching young children, and how are we socializing young children? I don't know if either of you have watched, I just finished watching Adolescence on Netflix, which has been making a lot of news for how young men in particular are being socialized, and the access that social media and the impact that is having on how they're being taught to understand their gender roles. And I think that's something that needs to be discussed. And I think what we're seeing is the kind of culmination of years of that in the political sphere. I'm not sure if that fully answered the question.
Thank you. Dr. Razavi, would you like to comment, if you'd like?
I can try. Although I'm notoriously bad at commenting on political things, but anyway, I will share some thoughts. I agree with what Dr. Seaman said. I think there's a lot going on in the younger generations, but also, and I think the question of masculinity is an important one. I fear that sometimes what happens, again, if one adopts a sort of dichotomous mindset, that you get to a place where it seems as if it's a zero-sum game. And that if you focus on women and the rights of women, it sounds as if you're not interested in the rights of men or the role of men. And I think a lot more proactive attention has gone into the advancement of women than understanding what it means to be human, or understanding what it means to have the qualities that have in the past been described as masculine or feminine, either way, but that they are in the remit of every human being and needed in every human being and needed in society. And the sort of, again, this is a sort of, it's messy, it's complex, I think. And maybe that's, again, going to the question about what have we done wrong. I'm not sure that it's helpful to use the word wrong. Again, maybe it's a dichotomous word. Maybe it's a thing like, what have we learned and what do we need to do differently going forward, to appreciate the contributions of human beings of whatever sex they are to a more holistic world, to a more peaceful world. I think there is, of course, a lot will come down to education, but even in that, we have to work out what we pay attention to. Education itself might have addressed some of these questions about. It has addressed questions to do with the progress of girls and the education of girls, which is really important, but it cannot be at the expense of education overall. It can't be seen that way. The good news is that we tried it and it worked. We were able to advance and raise up. I mean, you look at the statistics now on women and university attendance, right? Like there are more women than men at universities now. It's great that it's even, but we don't want it to switch the other way. But what we do know is that if we pay attention to a question and give it some focus, we can also make change. So I think we just have to acknowledge that, and not in the same way we've done in the past. Learn and go forward.
I want to just interject something. I may be, totally off on this, but I was just thinking, it seems to me that during times of rapid social change, that there is a tendency, and especially in the political realm, there is a tendency to want to fall back on old ways, if I can put it that way. I mean, I think we saw this just prior to World War I, when things were changing rapidly, when there were some insecurities that were emerging, and there was this tendency to really want the old days back, so to speak, the old ways back, the old norms back. And I think we saw it again during World War II. I use those, of course, because they were great, huge examples of the dysfunction in the world. But I think we are in a moment of great social change again. And by moment, I don't mean literally a year or two. It's a process, right? And so I wonder how much of that is impacting what this question posed in relation even to the political reactions that we see among people. There's, I think, that human insecurity for going back to a stable time, even though I would say that was not a stable time if we go back to it. But nevertheless, this is a psychological phenomenon that I think we need to acknowledge. And again, whether through an educational process we can address this more effectively remains to be seen. Okay.
But I think there's one other thing though, in relation to what you said, which is that it's going back to this idea of a paradigm shift. You can't actually shift a paradigm until you have something to shift into. So it can't just be a negation, like we don't like this, but we have to be able to move forward. So that kind of constructive orientation, which I think you're describing, but without it, your default is to go back. Say, well, we had something, so let's just go there, because we don't really have it's a vacuum in a way.
Yes, thank you. Thank you. So next question. How can we respond to the unevenness of progress towards equality? Or do you feel like we've answered this?
So I think we have to recognize the unevenness of progress towards equality. And also, I think this comes back to what I was talking about, is that equality doesn't look the same for everybody. And so what I may think of as equality, somebody else may not think of as equality. And so it's opening up the discussions to be more encompassing of a wider variety of experiences. So I don't think we can impose one idea of what equality should look like on everybody. And I think also we have to recognize the history and context that may have led to that variation in progress towards equality too. Yeah, I think it's an ongoing discussion.
Dr.
Yeah,
Razavi?
I agree. I think for me in the work and the reading that I've done, one of the questions that comes up is this issue of the deep and the surface, and that helps me to understand the unevenness of progress. I think I really think this idea of what equality is, not being a monolithic concept, is very important. And there's something in me that wants to reply to this question with an idea of increased awareness, to say that, our own experience, whether we're women or men, where we are in the world, it speaks much to what was to the chapter that Dr. Seaman was describing. Where we are in the world, when we are in the world, all these things really determine, and in even our idiosyncratic experiences, the luck of the draw in a way, right? It will determine a little bit what we think, where we think equality is, and where, how even it is, or how far it's going forward. All of that, I think, there's there. But in the reading that I've done and the data that I've looked at, I do think that this question of deep change, normative change, is something that it's very slow. That's the part that's slow, as I said before. But it everywhere in one form or another, I think that probably has to happen, because we are looking at a significant shift in the way that we think about the world and the people in it and their possibilities. So, and that's hard. I think that's a very hard thing. I was reading something recently that just came to my mind as an example. It's in a way a trivial example, but I think it's a good illustration, which is that a lot of the movement towards equality has been by women moving into spaces that have traditionally not been occupied by them. But the reverse flow is not as common. There's a struggle there. We're not seeing, for example, the number of elementary school teachers who are male is falling. We've seen an advance. The example that came to my mind is we've seen a huge advance in the participation of women in sports, and even in the profile of women's sports. They're making headlines, and people are happy and excited and going to games and all this kind of stuff. But it's not. But we don't see the opposite flow. We don't see men participating in sports that are traditionally associated with women. And so not many male netball teams, apparently. That's what I read. But anyway, that's the example. And I thought, okay, that's just like a little illustration of how, I'm not saying netball is that important, but but that this idea of the revaluing of things in society it still hasn't happened.
Yes. Yes.
It's still a reminder that these things are actually not that, not that important, the things that are traditionally done by women. Yeah.
Thank you very much. I think our time is over. And actually, I think we do not have any more questions on the Q&A, but I would like to thank both of you for a very, very interesting session. Much to contemplate, think about, and of course, conversations to be had ongoing and into the future. My hope is that we can also have another session where we feature two other authors from the book, so that all the perspectives are covered. But again, I direct you to our chat box, where you can find the link to the book, to the volume, and to the open access, free to read. And to again thank our speakers for their wonderful presentations, and the audience for joining us today. Our next event is in April, and it will be with Professor Melanie Killen, who is a distinguished university professor in the Department of Human Development and Quantitative Methodology. at the University of Maryland and also in the psychology department. She directs the Social Science and Moral Development Lab at the University of Maryland. The title of her talk is The Science of Reducing Prejudice in Childhood. Perhaps that's a very good follow-up to today's program, because much of the struggle for women's equality stems from the prejudices that we all hold. So I really hope you will join us on April 3rd at 2 p.m. Eastern Time. And this is in person on campus, but we may be able to also have a link to this lecture, and you will receive a notice about that closer to the event. Thank you again for joining us today, and we'll see you next time, and thank you to the speakers. Take care. Bye-bye.